Okay, so I'm going to begin now. Great to see everybody. So, last week we had done a whole series about the growth of anti-Semitism and its variant forms in the 12th century. There will be some different accusations against the Jews that were going to crop up in the 13th and even in the 14th centuries. But I tried to gear my talk century by century and country by country. I think it's just easier. Everything becomes more logical, and you can see the greater picture of what's going on in Europe, based on a particular time period. Very often, as we go into the Rabbanim, or that we call the Rishonim, it's like becomes this big blob of names, and it's very hard to really relate them to the time and place in which they live. So I like to go in a very orderly, chronological fashion. I just think it makes a lot more sense that way. Okay. So today, as I say, last time, we focused a lot on anti-Semitism and its growth, especially during and post the First Crusade. That was like the crux. And after that, it almost became open sesame, and all kinds of accusations came against the Jews. And then the authorities tried to, like mark the Jew by having them wear the yellow badge. It's all coming to the fore in the 12th century. That's where we're going to hear about it the most. Today, what I thought I would do is, so we've already discussed some broader themes about what life was like in medieval Europe. We talked about feudalism, how the Jews were locked out of that because they had to, they really could not own land because you always had to be associated with a particular lord or nobleman, and you had to swear a Christian oath. So the Jews were always on the periphery of society. And then we talked what will work to the benefit of the Jews will be in the medieval period is the gradual growth of cities. And that's like a crucial element to how eventually we will grow beyond the medieval period, because again, urban dwelling is going to become a major factor. Now, the time period we're talking about, though, it's still primarily agricultural. But the Jews, again, because again, they cannot own land, they can't have serfs, no slaves. So they will become the urban dwellers, the early urban dwellers, and that they are primarily of the merchant or small artisan class. And that's how they earn a living. And then we discussed how, again, because they're locked out of so many professions, they couldn't get into certain economic modes because of the guilds. The guilds too, you had to swear a Christian oath to become a member of a guild, to be apprenticed, to learn a particular trade and skill. So they were locked out of that. And then because, high and mighty Christians, the church said, that, what a despicable thing it is for one Christian to lend money to another with interest. But those Jews, those terrible Jews, they can do that business. And that's how we got into the wonderful business of usury. And I did explain, just so you understand, very often the interest rates were quite high, but it was a tremendous risk to lend money in those days because times were so unstable. And that's why, as a result, anybody in the business of lending money did require very high interest rates. Now, another key factor that you will understand throughout the Middle Ages is this constant conflict between church and monarchy. And at the beginning, the church is all powerful, and the kings are relegated to a secondary role. But as the medieval period will wear on, the monarchs are going to consolidate their power, and they will be in constant conflict with the church, and the church eventually will become always a strong presence, but gradually more of a peripheral role. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about that, and then we'll see how the Jews, fit into, that dichotomy between, church and, you could say, state, but in those days it was all monarchy. The kings were the rulers. And again, I did mention last time, just so you realize this, many of these countries are not united at all in this era. So if I talk about France, right, there is a king in France, but he's only ruling over the period around the Ile-de-France, which includes Paris and its environs. He's not ruling over the rest of the country. And Germany is also divided up. There is a Holy Roman Emperor, but there are all sorts of little dukedoms all over Germany. Very, very fragmented society. We will be discussing Spain, but Spain is different because, again, it's under Muslim rule at this point. It's going to gradually change, though, as the northern part of Spain, where the Christian monarchs will gradually take back the rest of Spain and make it all Christian. Okay, so let me just discuss a little bit about this conflict, right, between the church and the monarchy. Now the Jew, again, he's sort of caught in the middle here. Okay, as I mentioned, I'm just going to, I have some notes here. I'm just going to review some of the key points I've already mentioned. The Jews of Europe were denied feudal tenure because they could not pledge troth, swear their fealty to Christianity. It was always a Christian oath. And this becomes a problem, by the way, even into the 19th century, that the Jews, to become part of society, had to swear allegiance and was often using the Christian Bible or swearing allegiance to Christianity. Since their status had to be regularized in some way, okay, so who are these groups of people floating around? They don't seem to belong anywhere. They were eventually awarded the dubious distinction of serfs of the royal chamber. So they are going to become aligned more with the ruling monarch or a particular nobleman in a certain, political area. It was a legal notion. It first surfaced in the 1230s in the laws of Frederick II. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, but he came from Hohenstaufen. His domains included the extensive juries of Sicily and Germany. So not just Germany, but he actually was ruling over Sicily, which of course is in southern Italy off the coast. This designation had two important effects. Again, so the Jews are considered, right? Who are they the serfs to? To the royal chamber, to usually a monarch or a particularly, strong nobleman or in a principality in a certain location. This made the Jews, in effect, the property of the ruling sovereign, so that hostile actions against them were actions against the crown. Now, this could go to their favor, like the king would defend them if they were being attacked. Look, even during the Crusades, they then would turn to whoever was the ruling power at the time, or also sometimes to the bishops. Some of them attempted to, on a certain measure. They eventually just gave up because the mobs were rampaging, and they felt they couldn't do nothing against it. All right, so on one level, as I say, it sounded like to the benefit of the Jews, they're serfs of the ruling monarch or nobleman, and then they will then protect them as a result. But there's always a dual aspect. But since the Jews were the property, right, they were the serfs of the ruling sovereign, he could appropriate their wealth to whatever extent he wished, whether in taxes or through outright confiscation. And needless to say, they did not hesitate to do these things. The monetary demands of the sovereigns were generally quite harsh, that they tended not to take everything. Again, because what would they do without their Jews? This would have left the Jews destitute and therefore unable to provide further revenue. So as much as they might have disliked these Jews and thought them these evil creatures, who were members of their kingdom, but they were bringing in wealth to them and they needed it. Just one point I want to re-emphasize: first of all, most of the Jews, of course, were abjectly poor, but some of them obviously had money, and it was to those key individuals, that the monarchs, or noblemen would have turned to for money. Remember, I had said at the beginning of this medieval period, it is primarily the Jews who are the merchants, the traders. They traveled throughout Europe and into the Mediterranean basin, and then would have relations, obviously, early on with the Jews from Babylonia. Hebrew became actually the common language But as the medieval period moved on, Christians started taking over key positions in international trade, and then the Jews were forced out. But meanwhile, they had obviously accumulated a certain degree of capital. So it was with this capital that they were able to pay the heavy taxes, that were forced upon them, and also why they had money available, right, to lend to others, of course. And then they would, have required, the payment of interest, and then that's how they would have increased their wealth. Okay. The religio-legal definition of the Jew was a major point of contention between the medieval popes and emperors. Romans were like pawns between these two powers. The 13th century saw renewed interest in the difference between the civil code of ancient Rome and the broadly philosophical teachings of Aristotle. And both of these influences emphasize the division between the strictly spiritual and the temporal. So spiritual meaning the church. At this point, just remember there is only one church throughout Europe, and that is the Catholic Church. Start in Constantinople. That is where we have the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Church. But that's not affecting the Jews that we're talking about at this time period. It is the one and only Catholic Church. And the popes increasingly exercised direct control in both realms. So they felt not only were they the heads of the church, but they were in charge of temporal, of worldly powers as well. They were extremely powerful. And they asserted the overriding position of apostolic, that would be church powers. This was especially true of Innocent III, Gregory IV, and Innocent IV. And this is the time period we mentioned last week, was that Fourth Lateran Council, which was in 1215, which then passed certain laws against the Jews to differentiate them from the general populace. And that's when the idea of wearing that yellow badge came into being, became part and parcel of the law at that time. The emperors, particularly Frederick II, rejected ecclesiastical claims to political authority. Said, that's it, I'm the one in charge. It's not going to be the church, but it's going to be the monarch, the ruling monarch. This vigorous challenge eventually caused Frederick to be excommunicated. This happened once in 1227. We weren't the only ones dealing with a cherem. The church also had that policy. And again, it happened in the year 1239. Later on, Pope Gregory IV and Frederick engaged in a heated dispute over the management, religious and social implications, and foundations of collective polities. And I say this dispute between church and state is going to go on throughout the medieval period, but at the end, the popes are going to be diminished in their authority as the monarchs are going to consolidate their power. The battle continued through the 13th century with the status of the Jew a recurrent focus of this ongoing debate. And I told you we are like caught there in the middle. Now I want to pause a little. So how many Jews are actually living? Now, again, we're focusing at this point on France and Germany, all right? Later on, for a later lecture, we will discuss the Jews of Spain and what's going on there. But I want to concentrate just now on France and Germany. That's where the bulk of the Jews are living. Some of them are going to gradually move into more parts of southeastern Europe. They're going to go to Middle Europe, and then eventually it'll be in, to Czechoslovakia. It'll be in Austria. It'll be in Hungary. And ultimately, that's how most of us have our ancestry. They will find their way to Eastern Europe, specifically Poland and Lithuania. But that will be at a later date. Now I want to discuss a man. I was trying to figure out where to put him in because he's a very unique individual, but he's not a rabbinic scholar, which will be the focus of some of my talks. And this man's name is Benjamin of Tudela. Okay, why am I bringing him up? Because I want to discuss some statistical information with you. It's interesting. One source that I looked said he wrote a book called Sefer HaMasa'ot, which is the book of travel. But I saw another source that said it was another person who wrote that book. Regardless, this man did put down, he had a diary in which he composed, he traveled throughout Europe, and he wrote about the various Jewish communities that he met on the way. He was a famous medieval traveler, and he was actually a Spanish Jew. He was a resident of Tudela, which is in the northern part of the Spanish peninsula. Having gathered a tidy sum as a merchant, Benjamin felt that he could indulge himself in the way he had always dreamed. Just like some people, right? You reach a certain age, you feel you have enough funds, you want to retire, and then you travel. But of course, it was very rare in these days. Remember, this is the time period of the Crusades. It wasn't really safe to go out and about in the roads. Just to remind you, like when we talked about like Chaucer and his Canterbury Trails, this is like a conglomerate group of people who are traveling to Canterbury, and they're banding together. It's for their safety. That's why they're traveling as a unified group. So in 1160, he set out on a leisurely journey. He went across southern France into northern Italy and gradually made his way further south. Then he went over to Greece, and from there into Asia, and then into North Africa. So he really covered a lot of ground. His trip consumed 13 years. I mean, you're traveling by, donkey, horse, at a certain point, obviously, he might have gotten on board a boat also. What was unique about Benjamin of Tudela was that he wrote down, he kept a journal, right, of his travels, which obviously has come down to us through the ages. And that's how we glean a lot of information about all these far-flung Jewish communities. And he did not record all the experiences that he encountered, but he limited himself to giving the best information he could obtain on the Jews of these various places that he visited. Recorded their number. That's what we have some statistical information, like how many Jews actually lived in these various places. He wrote about their economic conditions, right? How they lived, their learning or ignorance, and the manner in which they lived. As a result, his diary is one of the most important sources of our knowledge about the Jews of his day. Now, I don't know if this information that he wrote down is 100% accurate, but that's our only written source for how many Jews might have lived then in France and or Germany. All right. So he claims that at the end of the 12th century, there were about 6,000 Jews who lived in the 6 major communities of France. Doesn't seem like a very large number, but we're going to learn about these most brilliant Rabbanim who are going to come out of this time period. But by the end of the 13th century, 150 locales in France now boasted Jewish settlements. So first, we're sort of limited more that Alsace-Lorraine area. There were about 6 towns whose names that are mentioned, but gradually by the end, just 100 years after, we're talking about there are already now 150 locations where Jews are dwelling. And then we're not quite there, but just to finish up all his writings, by the time we come to the early 14th century, in the year 1306, there were 100,000 Jews who then will be officially expelled. I mean, again, these are according to, now this would be post Benjamin of Tudela, this information. And some of them were then welcomed back, and that's going to be the pattern throughout France in particular. Expel them, well, but then we need their money. Bring them back, expel them again, bring them back. But the Black Death of 1348 further reduced the Jewish population. And by 1394, 1395, there was other expulsions. So at that point, and we're talking about France, that only 25,000 Jews. So it seems like the largest number was about in the 100,000 figure at a certain point in that middle ages. But getting towards the end of it, again, because of expulsions and disease and other, negative, lifestyles that they were living. I told you how it was filthy. Medicine was not accomplished in those days. So they claimed that there were only 25,000 Jews. This would be at the end of the 14th century. Now let's just turn to Germany. How many Jews were living there? Where did they live? There are about 20 communities about the time of the First Crusade. That's 1096. All right. And so obviously more communities mentioned for Germany than France. France seems to be a smaller population at that point. And some of this information, so I told you the earlier period, some of the information we're getting from this Benjamin of Tudela and the statistics that he wrote down. Now, some of these from Germany, we get the information. There was a Jewish chronicler. His name was Solomon ben Shimshon, and we gleaned information from his writings. And there were chronicles of two Christians in particular who also wrote about the Jews in their midst. And one was Albert of Aix, A-I-X, and Eckhard of Ora. Okay. Now, these Jewish communities existed mainly in the Rhine area, that's that northwestern section, so just across from Alsace-Lorraine in France. And they were the cities of Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. And then there were other areas, some more towns in the northeastern part of Germany, such as Magdeburg and Halle. And in addition, there was a major Jewish community in southern Germany called Regensburg, right? And on the basis of the Crusade Chronicles, it would appear Mainz had no more, though, than 1,300 Jews, while Cologne had roughly 2,000. So they feel that the total number of Jews was about 20,000. Now, again, there were no, census taken at this point. I don't know if even any Jewish records within any of these towns would have been kept for posterity, because the Jews were so often attacked during the time period of the Crusades. Many people were murdered. Their buildings would have been burned down. And then we're going through a period of many expulsions. So, we're basing this on these few records that have come down. Whether they're 100% accurate or not is just not clear. Now, I just thought I would take some time to explain, well, how are these Jewish communities organized? Life did go on, even though they were living in very, very difficult, challenging time periods, but they continue to earn a living in whatever fashion that they were able to. They did get married, they did have children. So how are these communities organized? Now, we're going to learn later about some of the key rabbanim, but meanwhile, so what's doing with the rest of the Jewish community at that time? The Jews of Ashkenaz took pride in governing themselves. They didn't rely, obviously couldn't possibly rely on the secular authority. When it was secular, they were either church or monarch. And the power of self-government brought with it important benefits, but also, of course, significant responsibilities. The concept of self-government was based upon precedents originating in Israel and Babylonia, and we certainly have reference to these in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And these roots of Jewish communal organization may be found again, right? They are recorded. If you study the Talmud, you will see, whether, of course, the major focus is discussing points of Jewish law, but they get all sorts of anecdotal information, so you can get a picture of what life was actually like, during that time period. And over the millennium, this precedent was never wholly abandoned. So obviously, when they lived in Israel, going back, until it was destroyed, the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed in the year 70. I mean, obviously, life was organized within, the land of Israel. When they went to Babylonia, they would take those same concepts and ideas, organize their Jewish communities there. And so it was then obviously written down, recorded, right, in the Mishnah and the Gemara, and then those ideas and concepts would have been transferred to these now European Jewish communities. It was of great importance to the communities of Ashkenaz whether community decisions required unanimity or the agreement of the majority. So here, this is just a little bit of should, again, if decisions have to be made within a Jewish community, did you need unanimous consent of all the key leaders? Or could you just rely on majority rule? And of course, these items are discussed in the Gemara as well. It was the view of Rabbeinu Tam. We're going to discuss him later because of his tremendous, tremendous contribution to Jewish scholarship. He was the first of the very great Tosfos, which these are from the 12th and the 13th centuries. But now let's talk about Rabbeinu Tam in a slightly different, aspect. He lived from 1110 to 1171. He was a grandson of Rashi. And he was the leading rabbinic figure in the 12th century. So this is a part of what he wrote and felt. Once the leaders of a community had determined the weights, the measures, the prices, and the wages, again, everything was highly regulated. This empowered them to act upon and penalize any violations of the community's practice. So everybody had to buy into this. This was then determined by the key leaders, whether they be the rabbinic authorities or maybe some people who had certain, again, probably because of their wealth, had certain major communal roles. But if you violated the rules, this would require the unanimous agreement of the, so before they would punish anybody, again, this is according to Rabbeinu Tam, everybody had agreed that such and such would be the results should you choose to disobey the rules put out by the Jewish community. But there was another 12th century scholar, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi, he's called the Rabbia. He disagreed. He held communal decisions only needed majority consent, not unanimous agreement. The next key person, he's one of, getting almost the very last of the Tosfos. His name was Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, and he lived from 1215 to 1293. And he was actually the great leader of German Jewry. So we're going to go, the earlier Tosfos are actually French Jews, but as you get more into the 2nd century of the Tosfos, the German Rabbonim are going to play a more major role. So again, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, again, a German Jew in the 13th century, he took the opposite approach, accepted the view of Rabbeinu Tam. All right. Back and forth, different opinions, how should things be regulated? I just found it, so interesting. I mean, again, there was a highly, highly organized Jewish communities, and people had to, whether it was majority or even unanimous rule, it then obligated the entire community to follow those rules and obligations. The communities in France and Germany were administered by elected officials. All right, so they had a certain measure of democracy, usually selected from among the wealthy. Okay, well, these were the prominent people. They felt they would have been the best spokespersons, for the Jewish community. The community at large showed their support for them by making their own financial contributions to help meet communal needs. You want to run certain activities, programs, certain services, you need money to do this, right? So they were taxed. Now they obviously were taxed to pay huge sums of money to the ruling monarch or nobleman, but they needed money for within their own community. These officials of the community were responsible for maintaining the principles of justice as set forth in Jewish law. They're always based according to halacha. This responsibility was usually given to the most scholarly of the elected leaders. So it became more of a, let's say the taxation, that could have been in the hands of the wealthier leaders, but when it came to something with dealing with Jewish law, they would have given prominent, authority more to the rabbinic leaders. From time to time, the communal leadership needed to enact new legislation. These are called takonos, and we've had them in the past, and we still have them to this day. All members of the community were compelled to obey these new regulations. And it's so ironic, I guess, because we live such tiny, compressed Jewish communities, we follow these laws. I mean, here and there, obviously, there were some individuals who maybe refused to accept it, but we'll see what happened to them. So almost all Jews, they are accepting the leadership, right, of these rabbinic figures, and whatever they say is the law, so be it. This power was sometimes limited, though, in order to protect the rights of the individual under Jewish law. So they always kept in mind, I mean, obviously there could be certain time periods where, or to protect a particular person, maybe so you would, bend the law in that particular case, depending on the conditions. As I mentioned, taxation was an especially important area of concern for the community's leaders. Now, how do they enforce themselves if somebody doesn't want to follow their rules? One of the instruments they used to enforce their decisions was the power of cherem, and this is excommunication. The church used it too. They believed in that also. One upon whom excommunication was declared, I mean, this is really a painful thing. If they declared cherem against any particular individual who refused to follow, their the halacha, the communal decisions, he would be totally ostracized. He could not be counted for a minyan. His male children would be denied circumcision. I found that very interesting. I hadn't known that. He would be denied burial in the Jewish cemetery, and business relations with him were forbidden. They actually, what I remember learning is that they actually, the rest of the members of the Jewish community, they were forbidden even to talk to this person. It was really a painful thing. Unless a man wants to totally leave the Jewish fold, and enter the Christian world, he would have had to buckle down. It's affecting his family, his future, if his livelihood should cherem be declared against him. In Germany, a significant development of communal institutions took place in the wake of the First Crusade, and we had learned in the First Crusade how especially those Jewish communities around the Rhine Valley, how they were just utterly destroyed. People were killed, their property was burned down. The communal leaders used to gather on market days and issue takanos in many areas of life. Takanos that would be binding on individual communities or groups of communities, depending on the particular case involved. The main purpose of such takanos was to strengthen religious life and to provide opportunities for increased Torah study. There were also takanos aimed at enhancing communal life. For example, everyone was obligated to pay taxes and prohibited from making false statements. And the officials, from the Jewish officials, had the right to shift funds around when the good of the community required this. The authority of the local leaders was strengthened by making it unacceptable for anyone to seek tax exemptions from non-Jewish officials. They don't want you turning to the non-Jews in your midst. You couldn't take your disputes into non-Jewish courts, and anything concerning marriage, divorce, or excommunication, that was all done within the Jewish fold. You could not take any of these issues, into the Christian world to have them adjudicate. Everything was under the aegis of the Jewish community. Now, they often had these convocations, so fancy words, the synods. Let's discuss some of those. In post-Crusade France and Germany, the many local Jewish communities began to work together. It was in this period that the first synods, or gatherings of representatives from different communities, were held to discuss the issues of the time. Under the leadership of Rabbeinu Tam, I told you he is one of the key early Rabbanim of the Tosfos time period. Synods were convened and takanos were enacted. He was a leader. He was not just this great rabbi, a man of great brilliance in halacha, but he was the de facto leader of the Jewish community. Among other things, the synods ruled that prayer services could be interrupted at any point by someone who felt that he had been humiliated and defamed before a non-Jew by a fellow Jew. So then you could enter the shul and say, so-and-so, he defamed me to a Christian, and you could interrupt the service. And anyone who had lived in a community for a month could be required by that community to pay taxes. And it was forbidden to remove a talus or machzor from a shul without the owner's permission. So any of you anybody might have taken anything from a shul, because now there weren't, when the lockdown had gone into effect, and then for Yontif, so the shuls were lending out, the siddurim, or especially machzor, and you haven't returned it, make sure you do take care of it. Later, synods considered other issues of importance. In 1215, a meeting was held to discuss how to deal with the rulings of the Fourth Lateran Council concerning the Jews, and I had mentioned to you some of those particulars, particularly the idea that the Jews had to wear these yellow badges to differentiate them. We don't really look that different, from the Christians, So we had to wear this yellow badge. Rabbinic gatherings were also held in, remember, Rabbeinu Tam, he's a French Jew. Rabbinic gatherings were also held in Germany during the 13th century and thereafter. A major issue confronted by the 1196 Synod was that of Yibum, which requires a widow to marry her late husband's brother should she have no children. And then the component of that is chalitza. The ceremony frees the widow from this obligation. The German rabbis favored the use of chalitza because otherwise widows would not be able to remarry the man of their choice. And didn't want to feel obligated they had to marry their brother-in-law just so that they could bear children that would then be in the name of their husband. So, this has come down to our day. I mean, I remember my father having to do a chalitza ceremony for a woman in our community whose husband had passed away, and first of all, the brother-in-law was already married himself, and so that ceremony had to be performed.
Can I ask you something? Ask something? So it's a necessity for the wife. Is it also required of the brother?
The brother-in-law, yes.
It's required of both of them.
Yes, they both, and they would both be there at that chalitza ceremony.
What about the yibum? The yibum is also required of the brother?
No, it's required, but to get out of it,
I understand. I understand.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. 3 more synods were convened between the years 1200 and 1223. At the first of these, it was declared that Jews were not permitted to cut their hair or shave their beards in the style of non-Jews, nor could they gamble, divorce their wives without the consent of the community, or refuse to perform chalitza. In addition, every community member was required to pay taxes to support all communal institutions, and you couldn't function without having money to pay for different things. The second synod confirmed the above measures and added that one could not use the utensils of non-Jews for Jewish wine, I guess in the performance of that. I don't know what I mean by utensils. Obviously, they're in barrels, but I guess you do need some utensils. And they could not eat food cooked by non-Jews. And look how some of these problems have come down to us to our modern age. And we discuss this, like especially if somebody has an aide in the house, can she do the cooking? By right, the fire has to be lit by a Jew. So a lot of these concepts and ideas, obviously, I think they would have had perhaps some discussion in the Gemara, but they're really going to come to the fore, in this medieval period. I guess among this would have been perhaps among the wealthy people. They obviously had servants in their homes who helped them. Every Jew was also obligated to set aside a fixed time for study, right? And we're still always encouraged to do that. And synagogue services were to be carried out with decorum. You can imagine, there was a lot of carrying on. So this became part and parcel of one of the takanos. I remember actually my husband finding on old records, so anyway, from Rochester, I don't know, it was from Beshul, it was the shul we went to, it might have been from Beit Knesset, Chodosh, right? The other shul, St. Regis. But there actually is in there, because you can't spit, and you can't have fights in the shul. So it's gone down. Even today, sometimes these things occur. The third synod reenacted and confirmed the decisions of the previous two. But notice how these now became communal or multi-communal, halachas, which were then imposed upon the Jewish communities within a certain region. The synod of Mayence. Now, Mayence, by the way, is the French name for the city of Mainz. So it's all that Alsace-Lorraine Rhine Valley region. In the year 1250, focused on the issues of cherem. The delegates prohibited any rabbi from declaring a cherem without communal consent. Right? He could just say, "Oh, yeah, I had a fight with somebody. He's going to declare a cherem against them." And it also prohibited any community from declaring a cherem without the consent of the rabbi. So they're obviously giving a lot of kavod to the position of the Rav. The Synod of 1280 was convened in Nuremberg, and was led by the great Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. And I told you he's considered among the very last of the great Tosfos. We will discuss them at a greater length next time. The major issue was that of a woman who leaves her husband with the permission and encouragement of family members. The Sinai decided that such a woman would lose all her property and all right to support from her husband as guaranteed in her kesuva. In addition, her husband was permitted to divorce her, even against her will. So I thought all these things are so interesting. So some of these things, which are so part and parcel, of our own Jewish communities, you can see how their derivation, a lot of these issues and problems arose, in this medieval period. And that's why all these convocations were called for to deal with them. Now, just a little bit more, how do they take care of their own members within each community? So let's talk about that. So these are communal functions and services. The communities of Ashkenaz were governed internally by a community board known as the Kahal, right? And so we taught like a shul, like we call it Kehilas, et cetera, okay? I would say some of the things that I'm going to discuss now are actually now performed by our federations. They are, so to speak, the umbrella organization. I mean, if perhaps your own shul doesn't provide these services, the overall Jewish community, in our case now the Federation, would take care of these things. Smaller communities were administered by only one official, while larger ones had several officials, including the Parnasim, that fancy word is an alderman, the Gabayim, who were like the supervisors, not just the Gabay and the shul. I mean, it was a little higher level position. There were also representatives whose primary task was to represent a community, a region, or even the entire country in dealing with the king, the nobles, or church officials. And this dates back to the time period of the Tanaim, when after the destruction of that second Beit HaMikdash, there would be very often delegations of prominent Jewish Rabbanim who would travel to Rome to deal, with the ruling Caesar at the time, to discuss areas of concern specifically to the Jewish community. So here too, we're in the medieval era, and they're doing similar things, although perhaps on a smaller scale. Although on occasion, if a country was, as we got later into the medieval period, and let's say the monarch started ruling over larger areas, so then they could be representative of an entire country. The title Rav, I found this very interesting, was in use by the 12th century. I don't mean rabbi this, rabbi that, but being the head of a particular community. And so it was in use by the 12th century, although the authority of a Rav took a bit longer to be fully defined. What were his obligations, and what were the obligations of the community towards this Rav? To take care of him, provide house, etc. Large communities had Rabbanim who functioned as Dayanim, the judges, administering civil law. There were also Rosh Yeshiva who served as the religious guides and would be the heads of various yeshivas, which existed in many of these communities. Other paid community officials included Chazanim, Shamashim, right? The Shamash who takes care of the shul, and the Shachtim, all right? Obviously, keeping kosher was a major thing, and so you had to regulate them. Were they using the right knives? Were they properly trained, et cetera, et cetera? And that leads us on to many levels of kashrus. The communities of Ashkenaz provided religious, educational, judicial, financial, and social welfare services. This in particular would be like our federation today. Religious needs focused on the synagogues, which served as places for prayer, but also functioned as community centers. You didn't have JCCs. So if you wanted to get together on any sort of a social level, even it would be within your synagogue. Religious leaders were expected to oversee the cemetery. All these things we have today, and it's like amazing, but it's already so highly organized, Believe me, this existed in those communities of Israel and Babylonia as well. But, again, the way to organize things, was transferred then to Europe, and eventually, it will go into, into the Jews of Poland, Lithuania. They had an organization called Vad Arba Haratzot, and they took care of these various functions. They would supervise kosher meat slaughter and maintain the town's mikveh. Community schools were supervised with taxes imposed whenever deemed necessary. And there were also libraries established. So part and parcel, whatever goes into a Jewish community that's felt necessary for that particular locale. In northern France in the 12th century, the principle of Cherem Beit Din was established. This principle meant that any local court could compel a resident of any other community to litigate before it. If you were called before the court, this could be allowed. No appeals to outside authorities could be made. I don't know whether that means to other Jewish communities or obviously for sure not to the church or the monarch. And each individual community would hold final authority. An additional power was that of cherem, which we discussed, religious, social, economic, and it was used widely. Additionally, the finances of Jewish towns were under the control of their leaders, who served as the fiscal agents of the local rule. Again, they would have appealed to the heads of the Jewish communities. We want X amount of money to be gathered up and put into our coffers. And again, it were the heads of the community who were responsible to see that this was done and the money was collected. These leaders in turn were then responsible for collecting the taxes, right, imposed upon the Jews. Finally, social economic services were provided to Jews by their individual communities. Ordinances were passed against mixed dancing, gambling, and any violations of family purity. That's Taras HaMishpacha. Charity was made available to those who needed it for food, clothing, and shelter, especially for the widows and orphans. The sick were supplied with medical care and any necessary medications, and visiting the sick, right, Bikur Cholim, was also regarded as an important mitzvah obligation. And that could cover the whole gamut, whatever you needed to have a smoothly running Jewish organization, they had it all put in place. And again, it was highly, highly organized. Thus, all the trappings of a social welfare community were well established by the end of the 13th century. All the needs of the Kahal's individual members were well provided for. The Jewish community took care of its own. Obviously, nobody else was going to take care of them, so they had to, take care of themselves. And they were obviously encouraged, to turn to the authorities. Do not go to outside sources. If you need help with anything, we will provide for you. So I think I'm going to conclude here. That sort of finishes it. Next week, we're going to continue with learning about the Tosfos, and you'll hear about the great, great Rabbanim who lived again in that 12th and 13th centuries, both for France and Germany. Just so you know, when we do Tosfos means those Rabbanim from France and Germany. We will discuss Spain and its great Rabbanim, as a separate unit. So everybody be well. If you are going away or having a holiday meal, have a happy Thanksgiving. And I guess we do have a lot to thank, Hashem for, that we do live, in a free land in the United States. And also that Halavai, we should all stay in good health. So that was a pleasure seeing all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Be well. Bye. Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Look forward to your son's drasha tonight.
Yes, me too.
Take care.
We have an Israeli call right now.
Did you listen to?
Calling from Israel, so we're going.
Oh, go speak. All right, bye, everyone. Bye. Bye. Bye.